Deep in the rolling countryside of southeastern Wisconsin, about an hour's drive from Milwaukee, lies a place that seems frozen in time. It's a place where the modern world feels far away, where dairy farms and open prairie stretch across gently sloping hills, and the air carries the scent of earth and history. But hidden beneath those pastoral fields and preserved in the undisturbed soil is the remnant of something extraordinary, an ancient city that thrived for 2 centuries, then vanished into the mist of time, leaving behind one of North America's greatest archaeological mysteries. Welcome to Aztalan State Park. For nearly 200 years, this site has captivated explorers, scientists, and curious adventurers who sensed that something powerful had happened here long ago. The massive earthen mounds are still visible. The reconstructed wooden palisade walls still stand. And the questions, the great unanswered questions about who these people were, how they lived, and especially why they abandoned their city, those questions remain as compelling today as they were when the first European settlers stumbled upon these ruins in 1835. This is the story of Aztalan, a story of cultural collision, of mysteries buried deep in the earth, of a thriving civilization that vanished without a trace. It's a story that continues to challenge everything archaeologists thought they understood about pre-Columbian America. Our story begins on a crisp autumn day in 1835. A settler named Timothy Johnson was exploring new lands in what had recently been opened to European settlement. As he traveled through Jefferson County, Wisconsin, he encountered something that stopped him in his tracks. Massive earthen mounds rising from the prairie, arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. Nearby, he noticed ridges of earth that formed what looked like the traces of ancient walls. Johnson recognized immediately that he had found something important, something that predated European presence in Wisconsin by centuries. But it wasn't until 2 years later, in 1837, that the world truly learned about Aztalan. A Milwaukee judge and amateur archaeologist named Nathaniel Heyer visited the site and was struck by one particular detail. He noticed that one of the mounds, the one in the southwestern corner, had multiple terraced tiers to it. Something clicked in Heyer's mind. He had recently been reading the travel accounts of Baron Alexander von Humboldt, a celebrated naturalist who had explored Central and South America. In those accounts, Humboldt had written about a site called Cholula in Mexico, which featured a stepped pyramid structure. Von Humboldt had also mentioned that the Aztecs believed their ancestral homeland, called Aztalan, was located somewhere to the north, possibly north of the 42nd parallel, which would place it squarely in Wisconsin. When Heyer saw those terraced mounds, he made a leap. Actually, he made a very big leap. He became convinced that he had discovered the legendary ancestral home of the Aztec people. He published his account in the Milwaukee Advertiser, named the site Aztalan in honor of the Aztec legend, and essentially launched a centuries-long mystery that continues to this day. Of course, we now know that Aztalan has no connection to the Aztecs whatsoever. Despite over a century and a half of archaeological excavation, not a single piece of evidence has emerged to support any Aztec connection. But that name, born from an enthusiastic misunderstanding, has stuck. And in a way, it's appropriate. Aztalan remains a legendary place, shrouded in mystery and wonder, much like the Aztec homeland Heyer imagined. So, if not the Aztecs, then who built Aztalan? The answer is more fascinating than any legend. Around the year 1000 to 1100 CE, a group of people arrived in the Wisconsin wilderness from the south. They were part of a vast cultural network known as the Mississippian tradition, a sophisticated civilization that had emerged along the Mississippi River Valley and spread across the eastern and southeastern United States. These were not primitive people living hand to mouth. They were architects, engineers, farmers, traders, and spiritual leaders who had built complex societies characterized by massive earthworks, monumental construction, and far-reaching trade networks. The heart of Mississippian civilization was Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, Illinois. Cahokia was not just a settlement, it was a city. At its peak, Cahokia may have been home to 15,000 to 30,000 people. It was the largest urban center north of Mexico until after 1800, when European American cities finally surpassed it in size. Monk's Mound, the largest earthwork constructed by humans north of Mexico, dominates Cahokia's skyline, a massive monument that still defies modern engineering comprehension. But Cahokia was not alone. The Mississippian culture expanded its influence across hundreds of miles, establishing outposts and trading relationships that extended from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. And somewhere near the northern frontier of this vast network, on the banks of the Crawfish River in Wisconsin, a group of Mississippian people established Aztalan. Why here? Why this particular location? Archaeologists believe the decision was deliberate and strategic. The Crawfish River provided water and food, fish, mussels, and turtles. The surrounding area offered rich farmland for agriculture and abundant game for hunting. There was access to forests on the opposite side of the river, providing timber for construction. And perhaps most intriguingly, there was a spring at the site. Springs held deep spiritual significance for Mississippian people, who believed them to be entrances to the underworld, connection points between the physical and spiritual worlds. Aztalan would become home to between 500 and 600 people. But these were not solely Mississippian people. Aztalan's story is actually a story of two cultures coming together: the Mississippian arrivals and the local Late Woodland people who already lived in the area. And this cultural convergence would prove to be both the site's greatest strength and ultimately, perhaps, its downfall. The Aztalan that emerged was unique, a miniature version of Cahokia adapted to the Wisconsin landscape. The city was surrounded by a massive wooden palisade wall, one of the most impressive fortifications of the Mississippian world. This wall was not a simple fence. Posts, each hewn from timber, were set deep into the earth. Between the posts, branches were interlaced and then coated with clay mud stucco, a technique that rendered the wall as hard as adobe and nearly as durable as cement. Remarkably, this clay coating also served as a firebreak, crucial in prairie lands where fires could spread rapidly. The palisade wall was not just defensive, it was also psychological. Its height and the elaborate bastions, square towers that jutted out at regular intervals, announced to anyone approaching that this was a place of power and organization. These bastions likely held platforms on which guards or observers could stand, surveying both the interior and the approaching landscape. But the wall was also permeable. Archaeologists have identified two distinct types of gates. There were small gates, just wide enough for a single person to pass through, narrow corridors that provided a psychological barrier to would-be intruders. And there was at least one large gate, suggesting that trade and communication were welcomed, that Aztalan was not completely isolated, but integrated into a network of exchange. The interior of Aztalan was carefully organized. 3 massive platform mounds dominated the landscape, positioned at the northwest, northeast, and southwest corners of the settlement, marking the boundaries of what early archaeologists believed was a large open plaza, a central gathering space used for ceremonies and community functions. A fourth structure, a natural gravel knoll, completed the quadrants. The largest of these mounds held a substantial wooden structure on top, a temple or the residence of a leader. Archaeologists aren't certain which. But within that structure burned a sacred fire, kept burning constantly to represent the sun. Once a year, at the time of the green corn harvest, this eternal fire would be ceremonially extinguished, then restarted to symbolize death and renewal. Then, the hearths in every private home within the city would also be extinguished and relit from the temple fire. This was not merely a practical fire-sharing procedure. It was a spiritual moment, a community-wide ritual that knitted the social bonds of Aztalan together, reminding every inhabitant that they were part of something larger than themselves. The third mound has no clearly identifiable purpose, or if it does, it remains hidden beneath the earth, waiting for the next generation of archaeologists to unlock its secrets. 80% of Aztalan has yet to be excavated. Beneath the grass and soil lies an entire city that remains largely unknown. Who were the people who lived in Aztalan? What did their daily lives look like? Archaeologists have identified two distinct groups living at the site, and understanding their interaction is key to understanding Aztalan itself. The first group was the Mississippian arrivals, the colonizers who brought with them the practices, beliefs, and technologies of their southern homeland. These were people accustomed to hierarchical societies, to cities where leadership was concentrated in the hands of individuals who directed the labor and attention of hundreds of people toward monumental projects. They were accomplished farmers who cultivated corn, beans, and squash. They were skilled craftspeople who worked with exotic materials like copper from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and marine shell from the Gulf Coast. They were traders, spiritualists, and engineers. The second group was the local Late Woodland population that already inhabited the region when the Mississippian people arrived. These people had a fundamentally different social organization. They lived in small villages or dispersed households. They gardened on a smaller scale and maintained egalitarian societies where decisions were made through consensus rather than through the authority of a single leader. Their pottery bore distinctive cord-marked designs, and they built effigy mounds, earthworks shaped like animals, to honor their spiritual beliefs. For a time, perhaps 2 centuries, these two cultures not only coexisted, but actually integrated. They built together. They created a hybrid material culture that blended Mississippian appearances with late woodland technologies. Archaeologists have found ceramics that show this fusion, vessels with the smooth, Mississippian-style exterior, but tempered with grit and local clay in the late woodland fashion. The people of Aztalan lived in homes constructed from wooden posts set into the ground with walls woven from branches and covered with clay. Some of these houses were semi-subterranean, partially dug into the earth, which provided additional insulation during harsh Wisconsin winters and cooling during summer heat. Scattered throughout the settlement were storage pits, some of them massive, dug 5 or 6 feet or more through glacial gravel. Over 70 such pits have been identified, suggesting sophisticated food storage and preservation systems. The residents were farmers, but they were not purely agrarian. They hunted deer, elk, raccoons, and birds. They fished the Crawfish River, catching fish that they would dry and preserve. They gathered nuts, berries, acorns, and wild plants. In many ways, Aztalan represented a delicate balance between 2 ways of life: the intensive agriculture of the Mississippian tradition and the resource diversity of the late woodland approach. For centuries, Aztalan remained largely as Nathaniel Heyer had described it and mapped it. The mounds were visible. The palisade wall ridge was apparent to anyone who knew where to look, but the deeper mysteries remained locked underground. Then, in the early 20th century, serious scientific excavations began. Samuel Barrett, an archaeologist working for the Milwaukee Public Museum, undertook the first professional excavations in 1919, 1920, and 1932. His work was instrumental in revealing the true nature of Aztalan. He confirmed that the largest mounds were not burial mounds, as had been assumed. Instead, they were platform mounds built to elevate structures above the surrounding landscape. He discovered the remains of enormous ceremonial posts, monumental timbers that had been erected and then carefully removed or allowed to decompose. Throughout the 20th century, excavations continued, adding layer upon layer of understanding to the Aztalan story. But it wasn't until the early 21st century that archaeology's technological revolution revealed just how much remained hidden and how incomplete our understanding truly was. Around 2015, a team of archaeologists led by Cecil Schroeder from the University of Wisconsin-Madison began using cutting-edge geophysical technology to investigate Aztalan without the destructive effects of traditional excavation. They deployed magnetometers, ground-penetrating radar, and other remote sensing equipment, essentially seeing through the earth without disturbing it. What they found challenged everything. The archaeological community thought it knew about Aztalan's layout and organization. The famous central plaza, that great open space that scholars had theorized for decades, may not exist at all, or at least not where everyone had assumed it to be. Instead, in the area that had been designated as the plaza, the team found evidence of houses stacked one upon another, with different layers representing different time periods. Prime real estate had been built upon and rebuilt upon, generation after generation. Upslope from the main mounds, the magnetometer data revealed a landscape dotted with massive anomalies, circular features that appeared as regularly spaced intervals. When archaeologists excavated these anomalies, they discovered massive pits, 6 feet or more in depth, dug directly through gravel. Some were lined with reed mats, suggesting they had held food. Others contained personal ornaments and food remnants, possibly indicating some role in mortuary practices. Were these public gathering spaces? Food storage for community rituals? Offering pits for spiritual ceremonies? The answer remains unclear, but their sheer number and careful spacing suggests that this part of Aztalan was far more active, far more significant than early maps had indicated. The implication is staggering. Not only is 80% of Aztalan still unexcavated, but the 20th century understanding of the settlement's organization appears to have been fundamentally mistaken. The city that archaeologists described, with its clear divisions between residential areas, plaza spaces, and elite zones, may have been far more complex, far more densely inhabited, and far more bustling with activity than anyone had realized. But prosperity and community integration did not mean peace. Among the artifacts recovered from Aztalan are human remains bearing disturbing marks of violence. Scattered human bones have been found throughout the site, some bearing cut marks suggesting butchering, others bearing signs of intentional burning, still others with evidence of being broken. In 1919, excavators reported discovering butchered and charred human bones and heads, the remains of what appeared to be enemies. The initial interpretation was cannibalism, that Aztalan's inhabitants had ritually consumed the bodies of warfare captives or enemies. This interpretation was sensational and captured public imagination, but more recent scholarship suggests a more nuanced picture. A taphonomic analysis, a scientific study of how and why bones are modified, suggests that while cannibalism may have occurred in some contexts, a larger pattern emerges. The primary evidence points toward intergroup hostility and warfare. The scattered, processed remains could have been war trophies, body parts collected and displayed as markers of victory, a practice not uncommon in indigenous warfare. It was also not uncommon for enemies to be partially consumed, not for sustenance, but as an act of contempt and spiritual dominance. But the great fortress walls, those massive palisades that had seemed to speak of constant siege and fear, the archaeological evidence becomes complicated there too. The wall does show bastions and multiple gates, certainly features consistent with defense. But the wall's location, set in a valley where hills rise outside it, meant that the wall would have provided limited tactical advantage. An enemy could position themselves on higher ground and look down into the city. Moreover, there are no signs that the wall was ever breached in battle. No evidence of destruction layers, no burned timber suggesting a final siege. The mystery deepens. Was Aztalan constantly under threat? Or was the impressive wall as much a statement of power and social organization as it was a practical defense? The true mystery, however, lies not in what happened at Aztalan during its occupation, but in what happened to it. Between 1200 and 1300 CE, Aztalan was abandoned. Not gradually, not over generations, but seemingly decisively. The site was left to the prairie, the buildings to decay, the wooden structures to rot and disappear. No one returned to rebuild. No successor culture established itself in the ruins. The city simply ceased to be. Why? This is the question that has haunted archaeologists for nearly 200 years. It's the question that appears in every scholarly paper about Aztalan, and it remains frustratingly unanswered. Evidence points toward a complex interplay of factors. Around 1200 CE, a severe regional drought began, a multi-year, possibly multi-decade drought that affected the entire Midwest. Such a drought would have devastated the agricultural base that Aztalan depended upon. Corn crops would have failed. The river itself may have diminished. Starvation would have been a real possibility. Around the same time, Cahokia, the great mother city to the south, was itself entering decline. A massive flood struck Cahokia around 1190 to 1200 CE, and the city never fully recovered. As Cahokia weakened, the far-flung trade networks that connected Mississippian sites began to unravel. For Aztalan, whose connections to Cahokia were so essential to its identity and prosperity, the loss of these linkages would have been devastating. There may also have been conflict. The drought likely displaced other peoples, forcing them to move south in search of water and food. New tensions may have emerged. The walls of Aztalan, those impressive fortifications, may have been continuously tested by hostile neighbors seeking resources. But perhaps the most intriguing possibility emerges from the cultural tensions that simmered beneath Aztalan's hybrid surface. The local Late Woodland people had existed in balance with their landscape for centuries. They had practices, traditions, and spiritual beliefs refined over generations. But to participate in Aztalan's Mississippian society, they had to partially abandon those traditions. They adopted Mississippian architectural styles, Mississippian social hierarchies, Mississippian spiritual frameworks. The archaeological record shows that they maintained some of their own traditions, but they were subordinate to the dominant Mississippian culture. What if, when ecological crisis struck, when drought brought famine and Cahokia's connections dissolved, and conflict appeared on the horizon, the local people began to question whether their abandonment of ancestral traditions had been a mistake? What if they wondered whether their departure from the ways of their ancestors had brought spiritual calamity? In the face of survival pressure, cultural tensions that had been suppressed could have erupted. The hybrid society of Aztalan might have fractured along cultural lines, with different groups choosing to leave and pursue different destinies. It's speculative, but it's based on the archaeological reality. Aztalan was a place where two cultures came together, and while they created something remarkable, perhaps the integration was always fragile, always contingent on prosperity and external connections. When those conditions changed, Aztalan simply could not hold together. Today, Aztalan State Park preserves what remains of this extraordinary place. The reconstructed palisade walls stand as they once did, their posts planted in the original holes that had been preserved by 900 years of earth. Visitors can walk the mounds and gaze out across the Crawfish River Valley, much as an Aztalan resident might have gazed 800 years ago. Archaeologists continue to work at the site. Each season brings new excavations, new questions, and occasionally new answers. The geophysical technologies continue to reveal the hidden landscape, suggesting that our understanding of Aztalan is still in its infancy. Future generations will likely have a far more complete picture of what daily life was like at this Wisconsin city. But certain mysteries may never be fully solved. We may never know exactly why the people of Aztalan decided to leave. We may never understand the precise political dynamics that led to the city's abandonment. We may never find a definitive answer to the question of how Mississippian and late woodland cultures truly coexisted and interacted on a day-to-day basis. Yet that's what makes Aztalan so compelling. It stands as a testament to the complexity of pre-Columbian North America, a reminder that the continent was not sparsely populated or primitive, but home to sophisticated societies that rose, thrived, integrated, adapted, and ultimately vanished. The ruins of Aztalan speak to the resilience of the landscape and the deep mystery of human history. And on the rolling Wisconsin prairie, where the Crawfish River flows past those ancient mounds, visitors can still sense something of the energy that once defined this place. The bustling center of a thriving city, the spiritual power of its ceremonies, the day-to-day lives of 500 or 600 people trying to make sense of their world. It's a feeling that no amount of scientific explanation can fully dispel. A reminder that Aztalan remains, in many ways, as mysterious as the moment Nathaniel Heyer first stumbled upon it nearly 200 years ago.